The physician told me I would never bear a child again. My husband's family quietly began looking for someone to take my place, but they never imagined that the Baron one would one day hold his own child in his arms while they would come to my door, almost on their knees, begging for one last chance to see him. It all began at a longevity banquet, the year I turned 17. The longevity banquet the year I turned 17. Red lanterns lined the hall, a gazang played softly beneath the scent of incense. I stood behind my mother, gripping the hem of my robe, then I saw him. Linfeng stood among a crowd of young noblemen, dressed in a deep blue robe, impossible to miss. While everyone else watched the stage, he turned and looked straight at me. I lowered my eyes, my heart pounding. He walked over, his voice low. "Are you from the Su residence?" I only nodded, unable to speak. We exchanged a few short words that night. But I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me. Years later, he admitted he hadn't even meant to attend that night. His father had forced him to go and mingle. 3 years later, Linfeng took me for a walk through the old quarter on a late autumn afternoon. Lanterns hung along the street, vendors called out their wares, the smell of roasted cakes drifting on the wind. He stopped at a silver stall and picked up a hairpin carved with a lotus. "Do you like it?" Before I could answer, he'd already pinned it into my hair. "From now on, if anyone asks, tell them Linfeng gave it to you," he said, a little smug. I laughed, touching the pin. "Since when does Master Lin get jealous? Only when it comes to you." He took my hand and pulled me on through the crowd. Late that spring, Linfeng asked me to meet him in the garden behind the estate at dusk. Peonies bloomed along the path, petals drifting on the breeze. He suddenly dropped to one knee, hands trembling as he opened a small brocade box. Inside was a jade ring, catching the last light of the day. "Su Xinyao," his voice shook. "Will you be my spouse?" I froze, my heart racing. The whole garden seemed to still. "Yes." I burst into tears, my voice breaking. He stood and pulled me into his arms among the falling petals, holding me so tight I could barely breathe. I was still trembling with emotion, gripping the front of Linfeng's robe, tears still falling. "Why are you crying so hard?" He laughed softly, wiping my tears with unusual gentleness. "Because I'm happy," I said, looking up at him, cheeks flushed. He leaned down, his forehead against mine, his breath warm on my skin. "From now on, I won't let you cry from sadness, only from joy, like today." I held him tightly, my heart racing amid the scent of the last peonies of spring. The following week, the two families met formally at the Lin residence, the hall lit bright with candles. Boyuan personally poured wine and set the cup before my father, his voice unusually warm. "My son is lucky to be marrying someone so fine." My father laughed, raising his cup in return, clearly pleased. Linfeng sat beside me, quietly taking my hand under the table, giving it a reassuring squeeze. I glanced at him and smiled, an unfamiliar calm settling over me. After the banquet, Ailin pulled me into her private room, closed the door, and held me tightly without a word. "Such a good child, I could never love you enough," she said, stroking my hair, her voice as gentle as a mother's. "From now on you're my own, understand? Whatever happens, you tell me, don't hide anything." I nodded, my eyes stinging. "Thank you for loving me so much, Mother." She stroked my head again, her eyes full of warmth, as though I'd been her own child all along. That night, Linfeng sat at the table flipping through an old calendar, his finger stopping on a date in mid-autumn. "What about this day?" he asked, his eyes bright with anticipation. I peered over his shoulder, curious. "Why the night of the full moon?" "So that every time the moon is full, you'll think of your wedding day." He grinned, full of confidence. I laughed and nodded, thinking to myself that Linfeng always had these unexpected romantic ideas. The tailor arrived the very next morning, carrying bolts of fine silk and brocade. I stood in the middle of the room, trying on the first red wedding robe, my hands trembling as I smoothed the soft fabric, equal parts nervous and shy. Linfeng, passing by the door, glanced in and couldn't hide his astonishment. "You look so beautiful I can hardly look at you," he said, laughing, quickly turning away, ears red. I laughed and pulled the curtain shut, too happy for words. The night before the formal betrothal, Linfeng slipped into my room late. Once the whole household was asleep, he sat at the edge of the bed and took my hand, fingers laced through mine. "Tomorrow we'll officially be family. Are you nervous?" "A little." I leaned my head against his shoulder, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Whatever happens after this, I won't ever leave you alone," he whispered against my ear, his voice firm as a vow. I closed my eyes, savoring that rare, peaceful moment. The next morning, once the betrothal feast had ended, Linfeng stayed behind to see off the guests, so he asked me to head home first. He'd follow as soon as he was done. I rode in the car alone with the family's driver. A heavy rain broke out along the way, pounding the windows, thunder rolling in the distance. The driver gripped the wheel tightly, his face tense as he peered through the blurred road ahead. "Young master, the road's too slippery. I need to slow down." I nodded, gripping the seat, still thinking of Linfeng's smile as we'd parted. Just then, the car swerved violently, tires screeching. The car swerved hard, tipped, and slid down into the ditch beside the road. Glass shattered, and then everything went dark. I only heard the driver scream my name before I lost consciousness. Back at the estate, Linfeng was seeing off the last of the guests when a servant came rushing in, pale as a sheet. "Young master?" Young Master Su's car crashed on the way home. Linfeng froze for a moment, then bolted for the door without even grabbing his coat. "Get the car ready now, to the biggest hospital in the city." He drove like a man possessed through the storm, hands shaking, muttering over and over for me to be safe. I woke in a stark white room, the smell of antiseptic thick in the air. My head throbbed, my arm bandaged. Beside the bed, Linfeng had fallen asleep with his head down, his hand still holding mine. I stirred slightly and he jolted awake instantly. "You're awake." He gripped my hand tighter, his eyes red. "Does it hurt anywhere?" "I'm fine." I shook my head weakly. He bowed his head, resting his forehead against my hand, his shoulders shaking as he fought back tears. That afternoon, the family physician came to examine me himself. He checked my pulse, reviewed the chart, his expression growing graver by the moment. "Young master, wait outside for a moment," he said to Linfeng, his tone unusually serious. Linfeng frowned but stepped out as instructed. I lay there, my heart racing with unease. Through the half-open door, I saw the physician lean in close to Linfeng and speak in a low voice. Out in the hallway, the physician lowered his voice, his face full of regret. "The injury has done serious damage. I'm afraid it will be very difficult for the young master to conceive in the future." Linfeng stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists. "Is there any way to fix it?" His voice was hoarse. The physician shook his head, sighing. "Medicine can't undo this. You should be prepared, young master." Linfeng stood there for a long moment, staring toward the door of my room. He came back in, forcing a calm smile. "What did the physician say?" I asked, trying to sit up. "Nothing serious, you just need more time to recover." He gently laid me back down, avoiding my eyes. "Really?" I studied him closely. "Really?" He leaned down and kissed my forehead softly. "Just rest. Don't think about anything else." I nodded, but something in my chest still felt wrong. Over the following days, I noticed Linfeng often drifting into thought whenever he looked at me, his eyes sliding away every time I asked about my health. "Are you hiding something from me?" I took his hand, looking straight into his eyes. "It's nothing." He forced a smile, squeezed my hand, and stood. "I'll go get you some water." He left the room unusually fast. I watched his back disappear, sensing something was very wrong. That night, I pretended to be asleep, waiting for Linfeng to step into the hallway to take a call from the family physician. I quietly cracked the door open and pressed myself against the wall to listen. Difficult to conceive. The physician's voice came through the phone, broken but clear enough. I clapped a hand over my mouth, my whole body trembling. Every word cut like a blade. Linfeng hung up and sighed heavily, never knowing I'd heard everything. I quietly shut the door and leaned against the wall, tears falling silently in the dark. The next morning, I smiled and talked with Linfeng as though I'd heard nothing at all. "Feeling better?" he asked, brushing my hair back gently. "Much better," I said, smiling, hiding the pain inside. In my heart, I told myself, whatever happened, I would face it myself first. I wouldn't let him carry it alone. Word of my condition reached Boyuan just a few days later, through the household steward's report. Master, the physician says the young Master Su will likely have great difficulty bearing children, the steward said, bowing his head, his voice cautious. Boyuan sat in silence in his study, tapping a finger against the wooden desk, his expression darkening. I understand, he said quietly, gazing out the window, already turning something else over in his mind. A few days later, Boyuan summoned Linfeng to his study. The air in the room was heavy, incense smoke curling faintly over the desk. You called for me, father? Linfeng bowed his head in greeting, still respectful. Boyuan set down his teacup without looking at his son. Sit. I have something to discuss. Linfeng sat, sensing this wasn't going to be simple. You know Xinyao will have great difficulty bearing children? Boyuan got straight to the point. Linfeng nodded, his face tense. The Lin family has had only a single heir for 6 generations. We cannot let the line end here. Boyuan looked his son straight in the eye. This is a duty you cannot avoid. Say what you mean, father. Linfeng's hand tightened on his knee. You need to take another spouse to carry on the family line. Boyuan's tone left no room for argument. Linfeng shot to his feet, his chair scraping back hard. I only want Xinyao. His voice was hard, unlike him. I won't marry anyone else. This isn't about what you want. Boyuan rose too, his tone stern. This concerns the entire family. Then let the family handle it without me. Linfeng turned and walked toward the door. Linfeng, Boyuan called after him, his voice softening slightly. Linfeng stopped but didn't turn around. I won't force you right now. Boyuan sighed, sounding suddenly tired. But think carefully, for the family, for the generations who built all this. Linfeng stood silent for a moment, then walked on without another word. A few days later, Ailin sent out invitations for a small gathering at the estate, calling it meeting some relatives. I sat in front of the mirror doing my hair, uneasy though I didn't yet know what was coming. At the appointed hour, a young man was brought into the main hall, slender, dressed plainly but neatly. This is Xinyao, a distant cousin on my side of the family, Ailin said, her voice a little too casual. I stood behind the carved folding screen, watching the hall through a narrow gap. Xinyao bowed politely to everyone, visibly shy, his eyes occasionally flicking toward Linfeng before dropping again. My chest tightened. I understood exactly what this meeting some relatives really was. My hand gripped the edge of the screen, forcing my face to stay calm even as my heart ached. Xinyao was invited to sit, growing more uncomfortable under the scrutinizing eyes of the elders. I just came up from the countryside. There's still so much I'm not used to, he said quietly, not daring to meet anyone's gaze. Ailin smiled, glancing quickly toward Boyuan as if checking his cue. Behind the screen, I realized Xinyao seemed no more at ease with any of this than I was. After some idle talk, Boyuan set down his cup and swept his gaze across the table. Let's not waste time, he looked at Linfeng. I want you to take Xinyao as your second spouse. The whole table fell silent. Xinyao lowered his head, his hands gripping the fabric of his robe. Behind the screen, my heart clenched painfully with every beat. Linfeng stood abruptly, walked straight behind the screen, took my hand and pulled me out in front of everyone. Xinyao is my only spouse. He declared it plainly, his voice ringing through the hall. I will never agree to marry anyone else. The whole table sat stunned. Ailin covered her mouth, unable to hide her alarm. I stood beside him, gripping his hand, moved and terrified all at once. Boyuan was silent for a long moment, his gaze passing over me before settling on Linfeng. Is this truly your decision? His voice had dropped, no longer angry, just heavy. Linfeng nodded without hesitation. It is. Very well. Boyuan stood and turned away. But don't blame this house for having no place for you anymore. The hall fell into a heavy silence after those words. That night, I sat beside Linfeng in our room, the oil lamp casting our shadows against the wall. The weight I'd carried all afternoon finally spilled out. Maybe You should just agree, I said quietly, unable to meet his eyes. I could step back and become a lesser spouse if it means peace for the family, if it means you don't have to be caught in the middle. Linfeng turned to look at me, his face stunned enough to startle me. What are you saying? You think I'd let you suffer like that? I don't want you to lose everything because of me. I lowered my head, my voice breaking, my hands clutching the fabric of my robe. Linfeng gripped my shoulders, forcing me to look up at him. His gaze was so resolute it left no room for argument. I will never let that happen, do you understand? His voice dropped low but firm. But if father really disowns you, no buts. He cut me off and pulled me into his arms. You are my only spouse. I will never agree to marry anyone else, even if it costs me this entire estate. I leaned my head against his chest, tears threatening to fall, my heart warming all the same. We sat up all night talking by the dim oil lamp, crickets chirping outside. If we stay here, sooner or later father will try to force this again, Linfeng said, rubbing his chin, his gaze distant. We should move out on our own instead, get free of all this. I looked up at him, worried and moved at once. Are you sure? Out there we'll have no one to help us, it'll be hard. However hard it gets, it's fine as long as I have you with me every day. He gripped my hand tightly without a trace of doubt. The next morning, before the sky had fully brightened, Ailin slipped into my room and shut the door carefully before speaking. I know I can't stop you, so I just hope you two take care of yourselves out there, don't let yourselves go without. She said, pressing a small cloth pouch into my hand, her eyes full of worry. I opened it to find gold ingots inside. Mother, I can't accept this much, take it, don't refuse me. She held my hands tightly, her voice breaking. This is just my own gesture, nothing to do with the estate's wealth. That afternoon, Kaiyang came to Linfeng's room and shut the door firmly behind him, his expression far more serious than usual. Are you really going through with moving out? He asked, a mix of worry and reluctance in his voice. Yes, it's decided. Linfeng nodded, still packing things into a wooden trunk. Kaiyang stood quietly for a moment, looking around the familiar room, then stepped over and clapped his brother's shoulder. I support you. Whatever you need, just tell me, even if I have to keep it from father, I'll handle it. Linfeng looked up, nodding, clearly moved by his brother's loyalty. On the day they left, Linfeng loaded only a few personal trunks onto the carriage, not touching a single thing that belonged to the estate's wealth. That's really all, young master? The steward asked, unable to hide his surprise and regret. That's all. Linfeng said simply, his gaze steady, not even glancing back at the room he'd lived in for over 20 years. I stood beside him, holding a small cloth bag of clothes, both nervous and determined to step into a new chapter. The carriage rolled slowly through the estate gates, and I couldn't help turning to look back one last time. The red lacquered gates faded behind the old trees, years of memories flashing through my mind in a single fleeting moment. Tears slid down my cheeks and onto my collar, but in my heart there wasn't a trace of regret. Linfeng took my hand and squeezed it gently, as if lending me his strength. Don't look back anymore. What's ahead is our real home now. We rented a small house at the end of a quiet alley, its whitewashed walls crumbling in places, the roof tiles missing in patches, letting the sky show through. I stood in the empty room, dust thick on the old wooden floor, feeling a pang of disappointment compared to the warm room we'd left behind. Kind of rough, huh? Linfeng laughed sheepishly, scratching his head, a little guilty. It's fine. I smiled and took his hand firmly. As long as I have you with me every day, it doesn't matter what the house looks like. On our first night in the new house, we sat at an old wooden table with two mismatched chairs, each with a plain bowl of rice porridge and nothing else. This will have to do for now. I'll go find work first thing tomorrow. Linfeng said, handing me the still warm bowl, a little guilty he couldn't offer more. I took it and drank a warm mouthful, tasting the simple sweetness of the rice. It's good. Eating with you, even plain porridge tastes better than a feast. He looked at me, the corner of his mouth curving into a rare, warm smile despite our hard circumstances. After we ate, Linfeng pulled me close and together we looked out the small window where moonlight spilled in, casting a thin silver stripe across the floor. From now on, it's just the two of us," he murmured against my ear, his voice warm, his hand holding mine tightly. "Whatever hardship comes, we'll face it together. All right, all right." I rested my head on his shoulder, breathing in his familiar scent, an unusual peace settling over me despite the uncertainty ahead. The next morning, Linfeng rose early, threw on a coarse cloth coat, and went out to the market looking for work. He went from shop to shop, from the rice sellers to the carpenter's workshop. "You know how to do anything? Any trade?" a shopkeeper asked, looking him over with suspicion. Linfeng shook his head, keeping his voice steady. "I've never done manual work before, but I learn fast and I work hard." "Then never mind." The man waved him off and turned away. By midday, he'd been turned down more than 10 times, his shoulders sinking lower with each rejection. Meanwhile, I stopped by a small fabric shop in town to ask if they needed help with sewing. The shopkeeper looked me over doubtfully. "Do you even know how to hold a needle?" "I do. Let me show you a line of stitching." I picked up a scrap of cloth and worked the needle through in neat, even stitches. She watched, then nodded, satisfied. "Fine, come in tomorrow, you'll be paid by the day." I bowed my thanks, relief washing over me. That night, we sat at the old wooden table and counted out every coin we'd earned that day. "I made 30 wen," I said, lining the coins up neatly. "I didn't earn a single one." Linfeng sighed, a little discouraged, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's fine, you'll try again tomorrow." I took his hand and smiled to encourage him. "Slow and steady, it'll work out." He looked at me, his gaze softening, and squeezed my hand back. Winter arrived earlier than expected that first year, the thin walls of the little house doing nothing to keep out the cold. That night, wind howled through the cracks in the door. I curled up under a thin blanket, my teeth chattering. Linfeng pulled me into his arms, wrapping me completely. "Come here, we'll be warmer together." I burrowed into his chest, feeling the warmth spread through me little by little. "Thank you for still being here with me, silly. This is our home, both of ours." He patted my back gently, his voice warm against the freezing night. A few days later, Linfeng found work as a dockhand at the harbor, among the burly laborers who worked there. On his first day home, his hands were already scraped raw, bleeding in places from hauling heavy sacks all day. "Does it hurt a lot?" I pulled his hand closer, wincing at the fresh wounds. "It's fine, I'll get used to it," he said, forcing a smile despite the exhaustion in his voice. I quietly fetched some ointment and gently rubbed it into each cut. In the days that followed, I kept tending to Linfeng's hands every night, watching calluses slowly form across his palms. Hands that once only held a writing brush or a folding fan were now rough and cracked from the heavy labor. I bit my lip, the ache in my chest too much to put into words, afraid it would only add to his guilt. "Why do you keep staring at my hands like that?" Linfeng asked, noticing my gaze. "It's nothing. I just think you've been working so hard," I said, lowering my head to hide the sorrow inside. One quiet afternoon, I brewed a pot of tea the way my mother had once taught me, using the last of some dried jasmine I had left in a cloth pouch. The fragrance filled the little house, drawing even the neighbors to peek in and ask about it. "Did you make this tea yourself? It smells wonderful." A neighbor woman said, her eyes lighting up. An idea struck me, and I decided to take a few small pots of tea out to the market to try selling them. On my first day selling tea at the market, I stood nervously behind a small wooden table, hands shaking as I poured cups for passers-by to try. "This tea's good, fragrant, not bitter at all," one customer said, nodding approvingly before buying 2 pots. Word of the good tea spread quickly through the small market. Within days, I had a steady stream of regular customers. I ran home to tell Linfeng the moment he got back from work, unable to hide my excitement. Seeing how busy my tea stall had become, Linfeng suggested quitting his dock work to help me instead. "Are you sure? The dock work is steady pay, at least," I asked, a little worried. "Selling tea with you is better, and it's not back-breaking labor." He grinned, rolling up his sleeves. "Let me build you a proper, fixed stall." So together, we built a small tea stall right on a busy corner of the market. One afternoon, Kaiyang showed up at the tea stall wearing a wide straw hat pulled low, as if trying not to be recognized. "How have you two been?" he asked, glancing around the little stall with a mix of sympathy and warmth. "We're doing fine, don't worry," Linfeng said, clapping his brother on the shoulder with a reassuring smile. Kaiyang slipped a small pouch of money into my hand, lowering his voice. "Take this for whatever you need, and Father still asks about you too sometimes, even if he never says it out loud." Weeks later, during another visit, Kaiyang let slip something that left us both stunned. "Father asked me the other day whether your tea stall was doing all right," Kaiyang said with a rueful laugh, pouring himself a cup. "He never mentions it outright, but I know he still keeps an eye on things quietly." Linfeng paused, still writing in the account book. "He really asked that?" "He did. I even saw him standing outside the market gate once, like he meant to come in but changed his mind." Kaiyang shook his head, a little bitterly. I looked at Linfeng and saw a flicker cross his eyes before he settled back into calm. Half a year later, after diligently saving every coin, our little tea stall had built up a decent surplus. "What if we rent another stall nearby, expand the business?" I suggested to Linfeng one evening, still counting the day's profits. I was thinking the same thing. Linfeng said, nodding, his eyes brightening. "With a fixed shop front, we could sell pastries alongside the tea too." We talked late into the night, both of us full of hope for what lay ahead. But the joy didn't last long. One stormy night, someone broke in and smashed the tea stall to pieces. The next morning, I stood in shock before the wreckage, shattered teapots scattered everywhere, the tables and chairs broken beyond repair. Who did this? I asked, trembling, tears threatening to fall. A nearby vendor rushed over and whispered, "I heard a big tea shop owner in town got jealous and paid someone to wreck it." Linfeng stood staring at the wreckage for a long time, his fists clenched white, saying nothing. I stepped up and touched his hand gently. "Let's clean up and rebuild." He turned to look at me, took a deep breath, and nodded. "Right, we rebuild." Together we quietly picked up the broken pieces and cleared the space, neither of us complaining, though the weight sat heavy on us both. News of the wrecked stall spread quickly through the market, and unexpectedly, many regular customers were moved to help. "Don't worry, young Master Su, I'll bring some men to help rebuild," a familiar carpenter said, hauling in wood, refusing payment. Other customers pitched in as well, and within 3 days the stall had been rebuilt even sturdier than before. I stood looking at the new stall, too moved for words, gripping Linfeng's hand tightly. 2 years passed in the blink of an eye. The small stall had grown into a well-known tea house along the street, customers coming and going from morning to night. A wooden sign reading Chungxiang hung above the door, each character carved by Linfeng's own hand. No one in the neighborhood was a stranger anymore to the story of the couple who'd built their livelihood from nothing. I stood inside, watching the steady stream of customers, quietly proud of how far we'd come. On a busy morning, I stood behind the counter brewing tea, the fragrance filling the little shop. Linfeng sat at the account book, jotting down the day's earnings, glancing up at me now and then. "Why do you keep looking at me like that?" I asked, blushing when I caught his eye. "Just enjoying the sight of my spouse hard at work." He smiled, his voice full of affection. We looked at each other and laughed amid the busy morning, a simple happiness spreading through the small space. One evening after closing the shop, I suddenly felt dizzy, my stomach churning unpleasantly. "Are you all right?" Linfeng rushed to catch me as I swayed, nearly losing my balance. "I don't know, I just suddenly feel dizzy," I said, gripping his hand to steady myself. He touched my forehead, worry plain on his face. "No fever, but that's not right. Let me take you to see a doctor right now." Linfeng threw on a coat and helped me out of the house, straight to the small clinic at the end of the street despite the late hour. "Doctor, please take a look. My spouse suddenly felt dizzy and nauseous," he said, unable to hide his worry. The doctor nodded, had me sit, and began checking my pulse carefully, silent for a long moment. I sat still, glancing anxiously at Linfeng, who gripped my hand just as tightly while we waited. The doctor held my wrist for a long while, his brow slowly relaxing until a smile broke across his face. "Congratulations to you both," he said, letting go, his voice turning cheerful. "You're expecting?" I froze, hardly believing my ears. What did you say? You're really expecting?" The doctor said with a laugh. "The pulse is quite clear, about a month along." Linfeng stood frozen beside me, his eyes slowly reddening, speechless. Linfeng stood still for a moment, then suddenly pulled me into his arms right there in the clinic, holding me so tight I could barely breathe. "It's really happening," he murmured, his voice shaking with emotion. "Did you hear that? We're going to have a child." I held him back, tears of joy streaming down my face. I heard it clearly." The doctor watched the scene with a warm smile, then quietly stepped out, leaving us alone. The next morning, news of our joy reached Kaiyang through a regular customer at the tea house. He came rushing in, out of breath, and blurted out the question before even greeting us. "Is it true? Is Xinyao really expecting?" "It's true." Linfeng laughed, clapping his brother on the shoulder. Kaiyang threw his arms around us both, his voice thick with emotion. "Finally, some good news. You two have been through so much these past few years." Kaiyang excused himself and hurried back to the estate, his heart racing the whole way. He went straight to Ailin's private room, closing the door carefully before speaking. "Mother, I have good news, but please don't tell father just yet," he said, lowering his voice, both anxious and hopeful. Ailin frowned, not understanding. "Go on, what is it?" "Xinyao is expecting," Kaiyang said, unable to hide the smile on his face. Ailin froze for a second, then burst into tears right there, hands covering her face. "Truly expecting?" she asked again, her voice shaking with emotion she couldn't hold back. "Truly, mother, I heard it straight from Linfeng himself," Kaiyang said, nodding, his own eyes reddening. Ailin pulled her son into her arms, tears still falling. Heaven has mercy, finally, mercy on those two children. That night, Linfeng sat beside me on the bed, gently resting his hand on my belly, his eyes unusually soft. "I wonder who the baby will look like," he said with a small laugh, fingers tracing gentle circles. "I hope they take after you, gentle but steady." I said, leaning my head against his shoulder, my heart full. "I hope they take after you instead, clever and strong." He leaned down and kissed my belly softly, his eyes full of hope for the future ahead. 9 months later, inside our small, warm house, the cry of a newborn rang out through every corner. The midwife lifted the baby, smiling as she announced, "A healthy, handsome baby boy." Linfeng stood beside her, hands trembling as he took the child, tears falling freely. I lay on the bed, exhausted but overflowing with happiness at the sight of our tiny child for the first time. A few days later, Linfeng held the baby in his arms, gazing at him for a long moment before speaking. "Let's name him Yaoi," he said, looking at the sleeping infant with deep affection. "May he grow up wise and content all his life," I nodded, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. "Yaoi. It's a good name." Linfeng leaned down and kissed the baby's forehead, his voice full of love. "Welcome to our little family." I held Yaoi close, feeling every small breath against my chest. For the first time in my life, I felt the full weight of a happiness so simple yet so profound, becoming a parent to this tiny life. "You know how long we waited for you," I whispered, gently stroking his cheek. Linfeng sat beside us, wrapping his arms around us both, his eyes full of contentment. Kaiyang came to visit as soon as he heard the news, carrying a small, carefully wrapped gift box. "This is a silver bracelet I picked out myself for him," he said, handing me the box, his voice bright with excitement. "May he grow up safe and well." I opened it to find a delicate silver bracelet engraved with a lotus flower. "It's beautiful, thank you." Kaiyang tried holding Yaoi's, clumsy but careful. "Hello there, little one, I'm your Uncle Kaiyang." In the years that followed, the tea house grew busier and busier, and our little family's life grew steadily more comfortable. We hired extra help and expanded, adding pastries to go alongside the tea. Yaoi grew up amid the lively chatter of the tea house, doted on by every worker who came through. Watching our life grow steadier, I thought quietly that all those years of hardship had finally been worth it. Yaoi was 4 now, growing quick on his feet, always darting around the tea house from morning to night. "Can I bring this tray to the table over there, Mama?" he asked, looking up, already reaching for the small tray. I smiled and placed it carefully in his hands. Go ahead, but slowly, don't spill it. Yaoi nodded eagerly and carried the tray off in careful little steps, so serious it made every customer in the shop smile. One day, while I was brewing tea for a customer, I noticed Yaoi standing beside me, watching my every move intently. When I turned away to fetch more water, he'd already mimicked the process himself, pouring the boiling water in just the right amount, measuring the tea leaves precisely. When did you learn to do that? I stared at him, hardly believing my eyes. I just watched you a few times and remembered, Yaoi said, grinning proudly. Linfeng, standing nearby, couldn't hide his astonishment mixed with pride. One afternoon, a wealthy merchant stopped by the shop and sat sipping tea brewed by Yaoi's own hands. This boy brews tea so well, and he's so quick and clever too, the merchant said, nodding approvingly. How old is he to be this skilled already? He's 4 this year, sir. I answered, bowing my head, quietly proud. The merchant thought for a moment, then continued. A boy this bright shouldn't be wasted here at a tea stall. I know a fine tutor in the area. If you're willing, I could introduce your son to him. That night, after Yaoi had fallen asleep, Linfeng and I sat discussing the merchant's offer from earlier. What do you think? Linfeng asked, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. I think we should send him to study, I said without hesitation. He's too bright to spend his whole life around a tea stall. I think so too, he nodded, his eyes resolute. Even if it costs us more, I want him to get a proper education. We looked at each other and nodded, both settled on this important decision. A few months after starting his lessons, Yaoi had become the tutor's most praised student in the class. Yaoi memorizes his lessons fastest, and his handwriting is the best in the class, the tutor said in front of everyone, making Yaoi blush with embarrassment even as he couldn't hide his pride. His classmates looked on in admiration, some even asking to sit beside him to learn his handwriting. Word of the bright young student spread through the neighborhood, and soon everyone knew the son of the Xinyao tea house. That evening, Yaoi chattered on about his day at his lessons over a simple dinner of a few plain vegetable dishes. The teacher said my handwriting was the best in class today, Mama, he said, eyes shining with pride. Well done, my boy. I stroked his head, warmth filling my chest. Linfeng sat across from us, smiling as he watched, occasionally chiming in to ask more about the day's lessons. That night, after putting Yaoi to bed, I stood by the window looking up at a sky full of stars, my mind drifting. Remembering the early days after leaving the estate, the hunger and hardship. And now, seeing our son grow up healthy, bright, and excelling in his studies, I felt that every bit of that hardship had been worth it. Linfeng came up behind me, wrapping his arms around me. What are you thinking about? I'm thinking that however hard life gets, having you and our son beside me is worth everything. I leaned my head against his shoulder, an unusual calm settling over me. A few days later, during the busiest hour at the tea house, Kaiyang came rushing in, breathless, his shirt soaked with sweat. Linfeng? Xinyao, he shouted, his voice frantic enough to draw every eye in the shop. Linfeng rushed over, gripping his brother's shoulders. What's wrong? Why are you so panicked? Kaiyang caught his breath just enough to speak. Father has fallen gravely ill. I was carrying a tray of tea to a table when I heard Kaiyang's words, and my hands shook so hard the tray slipped and shattered on the floor. Linfeng stood frozen beside me, his face drained of color, his lips moving without sound for a moment. How bad is it? He finally managed, his voice hoarse. The whole tea house had gone silent, every eye turned toward us. Kaiyang pulled us both to a quiet corner and explained everything in a low voice. He's been coughing up blood for days now. The family physician says it's serious, he said, his eyes reddening. He says, there isn't much time left. Linfeng gripped my hand, his whole body trembling. I held his hand just as tightly, my own mind in turmoil, unsure what to do in that moment. That night, Linfeng sat silently in the dark for a long while after Yaoi had fallen asleep, staring out at the black window. What are you thinking about? I sat down beside him gently and took his hand. I don't know if we should go back, he sighed, his voice torn. After everything Father's done to us all these years, is it even right to go back now? I stayed quiet for a moment, squeezing his hand tighter, not rushing to answer. "Whatever your father's done wrong, he's still Yaoi's grandfather," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "If we don't go, he'll never have the chance to meet his grandfather at all." Linfeng turned to look at me, a little surprised. "You're not angry at him." "I'm still angry," I admitted honestly. "But I don't want our son to lose out because of what happened between the adults, to lose the chance to see his grandfather maybe for the last time." He was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. A few days later, just as the tea house opened for the morning, Ailin appeared suddenly at the door, looking far more worn than the last time I'd seen her. The moment she saw us, she rushed forward, her knees nearly buckling as if to kneel right there on the floor. "Mother." I lunged forward, and together with Linfeng we caught her by the shoulders, keeping her from going down. "Let me kneel. I've wronged you both too much," she said, choked with tears, her whole body still trembling in our arms. We helped her inside and sat her down in a nearby chair. She was still shaking, tears streaming down a face lined with more years than before. "I've carried this guilt for so long," she said, gripping my hand, her voice breaking. "I knew how hard you both had it, but I didn't dare visit, afraid it would only make your father angrier." I squeezed her hand back, my own chest aching. "Don't blame yourself anymore, Mother." Linfeng stood beside us, silent, watching his mother with a complicated look on his face. Ailin wiped her tears and continued, her voice trembling as she told us what had been happening at the estate. "Your father drifts in and out of consciousness now. Sometimes, in his delirium, he keeps calling your name," she said, looking at Linfeng, her eyes full of sorrow. "He just wants to see you once before it's too late." Linfeng's jaw tightened, his fist clenched, unable to speak for a moment. "Please, son, go see your father just once," Ailin said, gripping his hand, pleading. Just then, Yaois came running out from inside and, seeing his mother and grandmother in tears, stopped in confusion. "Mama, why are you crying?" he asked, stepping closer carefully, his eyes wide with worry. "Who's this, Mama?" I quickly wiped my tears and knelt down to look at him. "This is your grandmother." "Whose grandfather? Why is everyone so sad?" Yaois asked again, his innocent voice not understanding what was happening. I pulled Yaois into my arms, gently stroking his hair, keeping my voice as calm as I could. "Grandfather is your father's father," I said softly, looking at him with affection. "He's very sick right now and he's waiting to meet you." Yaois blinked, still not fully understanding, but nodded obediently. "Then let's go see grandfather, Mama, so he'll be happy." His innocent words brought tears to both Linfeng's and my eyes. That night, we packed our things carefully, preparing for the journey back to the estate after so many years away. Yaois ran around excitedly, packing a few of his small toys into a cloth bag himself. "Did you remember your warm coat?" I checked over our things one more time, my hands still trembling with nerves. Linfeng stood beside me and draped a thick coat over my shoulders. "Let's go. Everything will be all right." In the car, I sat beside Linfeng, his hand gripping mine the entire way. "Are you scared?" I asked softly, seeing the weight in his eyes. "A little," he admitted honestly, holding my hand tighter. "But knowing I might get to see father one last time, I know I have to go." Yaois sat in the back, leaning against the window, watching the scenery pass, unaware of the tension hanging between his parents. The car stopped in front of the familiar estate gates, the once bright red lacquer now faded and worn with time. I stepped out and stood looking at the gate, a swirl of nostalgia and worry rising in my chest. I remembered standing in this very spot the day we left, turning back for one last look, tears I couldn't hold back. "Let's go in." Linfeng took my hand, his voice steady despite everything, and led our small family through the gates after all these years. The car came to a stop in the courtyard, and the servants nearby froze for a moment before breaking into murmurs at the sight of Linfeng stepping down with me and Yaois. "The young master? The young master's back," an old servant cried out, hurrying inside to spread the news. Other servants stood watching from a distance, their eyes a mix of surprise and joy, some quietly wiping away tears. I held Yaoi's hand tightly and followed Linfeng straight toward the main hall, where Boyuan lay in his sick. The door to the sick room opened, the heavy scent of herbal medicine hitting us at once. Linfeng stepped in first and stopped short at the sight of his father lying in bed. Boyuan had grown gaunt, his cheeks hollow, his breath rattling weakly with each inhale. I stood behind, gripping Yaoi's shoulder, my own chest tightening at the sight. Linfeng walked slowly toward the bed, his hands trembling uncontrollably. Hearing footsteps, Boyuan struggled to open his eyes, his clouded gaze turning toward the door. Recognizing the familiar figure, his eyes suddenly brightened, his lips trembling as he tried to speak. "Linfeng, you've come home?" His voice was hoarse, broken by his weak breathing. Linfeng choked up, unable to say a word, only nodding, his eyes reddening. Linfeng dropped to his knees beside the bed, taking his father's thin, frail hand in his own. "Father, I'm home," he said, his voice breaking, tears falling freely. "I'm sorry it took so long." Boyuan shook his head weakly, using what strength remained to squeeze his son's hand. "No. It was my fault. I'm sorry, son." The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the choked sobs of father and son. I gently guided Yaois toward the bed, leaning down to whisper in his ear, "Go say hello to grandfather." Yaois stepped forward shyly, standing beside Linfeng, looking up at the old man in the bed with wide eyes. "Grandfather," I said softly. "This is your grandson, Yaois." Yaois bowed politely. "Hello, grandfather." Boyuan turned to look at the child, his clouded eyes suddenly lighting up as though filled with new life. This is my grandson," he asked, his voice trembling with emotion, the corner of his mouth curving into a rare smile. "Yes, our son," Linfeng answered, his own voice thick with emotion. Boyuan gazed at Yaois without looking away, as if trying to memorize every detail of the grandchild he'd never had the chance to meet. Boyuan reached out a trembling, frail hand and gently rested it on Yaoi's head, the motion slow and tender. "Such a good boy," he said softly, then turned to me, his eyes full of regret. "Son, I was wrong all those years ago. I treated you terribly." "I'm sorry, I know it's far too late, but I still needed to say it." I bowed my head, unable to hold back my tears. "Please don't say that, father, it's all in the past now." The whole family gathered around the bed. Ailin and Kaiyang were there too, watching this long overdue reunion in silence. Boyuan reached out and took each of our hands in turn, Linfeng's, then mine, then Ailin's, his eyes full of contentment. "With everyone here, I have nothing left to regret." He murmured, his voice easier now than before. Yaois took his grandfather's hand and said softly, "Get well soon, grandfather." That night, Boyuan drifted into a deep sleep, his breathing growing steadier, his face peaceful for the first time in days. The whole family stayed by his bedside, no one willing to leave, keeping watch together through what would be his final rest. Near dawn, his breathing slowed, then stopped altogether, as gentle as falling asleep, with his wife, son, daughter-in-law, and grandson all beside him to see him off. No one wept aloud. Only quiet tears fell in the still room. Years later, when Yaois had grown into a young man, I sat with him beneath the eaves of the familiar tea house, telling him the whole story from all those years ago. Yaois listened in silence, moved to learn of the difficult journey his parents had once walked. I looked at him and smiled gently, closing the story with one simple line that carried everything within it. However hard the road gets, our family always finds its way back to each other. Sometimes life doesn't take away a person's happiness through accident alone, but through the greed and selfishness of the people around them. But if it were you, could you forgive a family that once cast you aside simply because they came to realize in the end they were wrong? Or are there wounds that should never get a second chance?